subtitled How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created Digital Revolution. And Andy was taking a shower, I think, when he came up with a joke, which, as you can go to the next slide, should write a counter-volume called The Maintainers, How Bureaucrats, Engineers, and Introverts Created Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time. And then we started messing around with it. I wrote a blog post, and we were goofing around on Twitter, and we started getting some kind of support. You can go to the next slide. We held the first conference at Stevens Institute of Technology in 2016. We held a second one in 2017. In 2016, our Hail the Maintainers essay came out. And when the first conference and essay came out, you can go to the next slide, something very unexpected happened. It just kind of blew up. It just took off. And this is not something that normally happens with, like, history of technology conferences. That's just not an experience historians of geeks who study the history of technology have. So we got picked up by the Atlantic and Guardian. You can go to the next slide. I got invited to Australia to give a talk, and there was a Freakonomics radio episode. You can go to the next slide. We got invited to write an op-ed at the New York Times. Next slide. Eventually we got a book contract for writing a book called The Innovation Delusion. You can go to the next slide, which is the maintainer slide again. And, you know, the reason I tell this story is because I've tried to get attention from other work I've done very hard, and yet Andy made a joke in the shower, and it kind of just took off and seemed to have a power of its own. And, you know, what interests me about that is that I think the joke, this maintainers idea, the metaphor of the maintainers, is a powerful one, and I often kid with Andy that, you know, if Tolkien was writing this story, it would be like the fellowship or the joke or the stewardship of the joke. And so what I want to talk about today is how we've been thinking about this idea. But in the end, I think that people use the maintainers idea to do their own thinking and to do their own work in their organizations and professions. And we're as interested in hearing from people what they're doing with it as we are in continuing to build on it ourselves. So the next slide is just a brief outline of what I want to talk about briefly, which is give a brief history of what we call innovation speak, to talk about what we're thinking, and then to talk about where we're headed. So the next slide, a brief history of innovation speak. Next slide. We often we want to make a distinction between actual innovation, which is the act of introducing new things into the world, and what we call innovation speak, which is how we've come to talk and think about innovation and even act on it. Go to the next slide. In the church-dominated Middle Ages, innovation was heresy. So in 1548, the King of England, Edward VI, issued a proclamation against those who would innovate. So, you know, part of our, you know, a central question is how this idea that at one point was like the worst thing you could do and literally get you killed has become something that we're all supposed to aspire to. Next slide. If I was giving a longer talk, I'd say, you know, it's a complicated story that has a lot to do with actual innovation and technological change, but the rise of the word innovation is primarily a post-World War II phenomenon. And there's a lot of factors that led to this, too, but one of them is that the U.S. and other countries, it was economists who were trying to understand economic growth. And traditional factors like changes in labor and capital just weren't explaining all the growth, so they hypothesized technological change, which they came to describe as innovation, was the leading growth. So if you go to the next slide, oh, and by the way, these are Google Ngrams. They show patterns of word use over time. And what the next one shows is that the phrase technological innovation was taking off in this, basically in the 1960s, late 50s, 1960s, as economists and policymakers and business leaders were trying to figure out how to kind of unleash innovation. Next slide. Something that reinforces this trend is that in the late 70s and onwards, we have takeoff the notion of innovation policy, which is that government should be putting more and more effort into fostering innovation, either through funding research or tax cut or education changes, etc. Next slide. And about the same time that innovation policy is taking off as a notion, you see the first book being published on Silicon Valley. And these first books are really kind of like self-help books for policymakers. It's all about turning your locality or your city in whatever country into the next Silicon Valley. Next slide. And then, since from the 1990s to the present, there's just been this kind of innovation oversaturation where there's all these kind of jargony terms, mostly kind of Silicon Valley approved and stamped jargon like agile and lean and, change agents and thought leaders and all this kind of stuff that we continue to hear, unfortunately. Next slide. We believe that innovation speak comes with costs and consequences of various sorts. Next slide. There's just like a serious question: does innovation speak lead to actual innovation in any demonstrable way? I think I'm more and more inclined to believe the answer is no. Even though we've had about 50 plus years talking about innovation all the time, it's very hard to demonstrate that all this chatter has led to us being any more innovative than we have been in the history of industrial capitalism. Next slide. And yet, even though we can't demonstrate that all this talk is leading to actual change, or even especially socially beneficial change, we're changing a lot of, altering a lot of deep institutions in our culture, like higher education, government, and business, in profound ways that we think come with costs. So I work in higher education. I'm very worried about how innovation discourse is used to kind of corporatize universities. But if you don't care about universities, I think the same is true of businesses and government. Next slide. It's not at all clear that Silicon Valley should be a mental model that we seek to become. Silicon Valley is an extremely unequal place. I think, there's been a real turn against Silicon Valley in the last year or so because of sexism and racism, but also, it's a staggering, unequal place with a lot of division between have and have not. Next slide. This is crack cocaine. We often point out that according to strict definitions of economic innovation, crack cocaine was a hugely successful innovation in the 1980s. It was a new product that took off and took over the market. It had a lot of risky entrepreneurship called drug dealing. It was disruptive to whole communities. You can go on and on. Go to the next slide. This guy's an entrepreneur, clearly. And the point here is that, innovation is not an inherent good, and yet we treat it as one. And as I said, I think there's all kinds of the mostly focus on, you can go to the next slide, is that, we argue that in a lot of spheres of human activity, whether it's governance or business or any other organization, we're often paying too much attention to innovation and not to the kind of more fundamental processes that keep things going, which we deal with the maintainers. Go to the next slide. Now, we often point out that we believe that the maintainers is not itself an innovation. It's about bringing older perspectives to bear. So we often talk about Ruth Cowan's book, More Work for Mother, which is about women's housework. Go to the next slide. This is David Anderson's Shock the Old, which everyone should read, which deals with maintenance and has been a big inspiration for it. Next slide. What I want to do today is just talk about three main points that we tend to emphasize. Next slide. First is that technology is not innovation. Obviously, most of the technologies around us you can go to the next slide, and that make up our daily lives are not innovations or new technologies. For instance, fans, the electric fan has not changed fundamentally since about 1900 or something like that. But next slide, if you don't like qualitative reflections like that one, like you're an engineer or, I don't know, just a quant head for whatever reason, we also have numbers. We don't have good national level numbers. We get good industry level ones. And for instance, in the software industry, about 70%, roughly 60 to 80% of software budget goes into maintenance, and a relatively small portion of it goes into design or introducing new things. Now, software is funny because, of course, we do changes through maintenance, but we see similar things in other industries. That a huge portion of budget goes into maintenance. It's very fundamental. It is more often done than innovation. Go ahead to the next slide. Another thing we focus on is that infrastructure is crucial. If we reflect on our daily experience with technologies, they're connected to electricity or water or, you name your favorite large-scale technological system that involves concrete or communication systems or what have you. Now, David pointed out, for the next slide, that often the maintainers is a kind of, I would say, U.S.-centered discourse because we have deep infrastructural problems in the United States. Every 3 or 4 years, we release something called the Infrastructure Report Card, and we always get failing grades. Go to the next slide. However, with the recent bridge collapse in Italy, there's been a bunch of articles asking whether there aren't serious problems in Europe. Well, I think The Economist and other journals written about this. You can go to the next slide. The third point, we really want to talk about the maintainers, the humans that are doing the work. And there's often, it's not, some maintainers make a great deal of money, others don't, some have high status, others don't, but we often find that, especially in the United States, much maintenance labor is low status. Go to the next slide. And as a historian, we're interested in how status trajectories change over time. So, to be a mechanic or to be an electrician, in the late 19th century, for instance, was a relatively high status occupations that you would aspire to be, and then those fall over time. We see something similar with the electricity industry, where before World War II, was very high status. If you were a smart person coming out of college, that you'd want to go into electric power. Later, it's electronics and computing. So these categories are not static, but things have a tendency to become lower status over time, often. There are exceptions. You go to the next slide. This is a Wired article suggesting that, coding, which people see as kind of high status right now, will eventually become more blue collar. Next slide. One model we look to is Susan Cain's Quiet, which is a book about introverts and how our culture and organizations often fail to recognize work they do. A lot of people have made an analogy between that and the maintenance work. I think some maintainers, like the IT crowd, for instance, are introverts, but there's not a one-to-one correspondence, but we think there is a kind of analogy to be made about how status operates in our society. Okay, go to the next slide. Where we're headed from here. Next slide. We are scholars, and we're interested in writing the history and sociology of maintenance. I follow David Edgerton in believing that when we do this kind of work, we need to kind of pull away from some of the moral and political questions that might have driven our interest in the first part, and just be like, what is the history and sociology of maintenance? And I spent all that summer in a library in Kansas City working on this question. One product that's going to come out of this work is an edited volume on David's idea of technologies in use that will hope to get at this more. Next slide. The other thing is, how do we rethink education in the light of the ideas out of the maintainers. You can go to the next slide. And I'll just give you one example of what I'm talking about. Most engineering education in industrialized nations is focused on design and innovation, or innovation. If you look at the awards that IEEE or the Engineering Society put out, they're all invented. Well, 70% working engineers focus on maintenance and oversight of existing things. So, like, where does the actual labor that most of the people coming out of engineering programs do fit in curriculum? So we're involved with engineering education scholars and engineers thinking about, like, how can we kind of attack harder in the direction of reality instead of pretending that we're training people to become innovators, which we're often not. Next slide. The interesting, keep your fingers crossed for us, where it looks like we will be funded by a foundation here in the States to do more work, something called the Maintenance Community Framework. And what this involves is working with different sectors and practitioner groups to create reports and toolkits addressing maintenance in their area. And so one anecdote I could give you is that I've seen libraries in the United States, for instance, hold organizational conversations together using our Hail to Maintainers essay to talk about how they can think more robustly about maintenance and maintaining in their organization and role maintainers in their organization. And so the goal of this MCF project is to create, toolkits and worksheets and educational materials that will help professions and organizations deal with this in a slightly more structured manner. And I could talk more about what groups we're going to look at first, but for now I think I'll just say that if you're interested in this project, or just interested in maintainers in general, have ideas for us or want to chat, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us, either via Twitter or just write me an email, whatever. Just reach out. So next slide, this says thanks, and I want to thank you again for inviting me to chat with you. And I really wish I could be there to learn from you and hang out.
Thanks so much, Lee. Just since we have you live on the internet, I will see if there's any quick questions from the room. Everyone is stunned. Yeah, we've got one question.
What should we do here in the UK to kind of grow on this interest that we've got in the room?
So the question is,
The
question is, what should we do here in the UK to sort of grow this movement and community?
Yeah, I mean, Laura, you and I are going to have a conversation next month, but we are interested in making these international connections. It looks like we're going to have a Les Maintainers conference in Paris in December. So we would like to formalize relationships and start having meetings and get-togethers. We do a lot of this work via online, virtually, just by getting on Google Chat or Skype or whatever. So if people have ideas for projects or, want to have meetings, we're open to that. And otherwise, I think, the model is to have meetups and, the way we grow movements. Good question.
Cool. Thank you so much, Lee. I think the line is just breaking up, so this is a perfect time to wrap. And
Okay, good.
yeah, we'll take this forward. That sounds like a good